The sacred guardian of Umuahia. The village of Umuahia lay nestled between lush green hills, its fields stretching endlessly under the golden African sun. It was a place of peace and prosperity, where the people lived in harmony with the land, the rivers, and the spirits that washed over them. Among these sacred guardians, none was more revered than the Eke Python, the living messenger of Ola, the earth goddess. For generations, the villagers had believed that as long as the Eke Python roamed freely, their land would remain fertile, their children safe, and their homes protected from harm. To harm the python was unthinkable, an act of grave disrespect to Ola herself. The python was not just an animal, it was a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, a sacred being that carried the blessings of the gods. Each year, the village gathered beneath the full moon for the festival of the Sacred Eke. Women prepared dishes of yams, plantains, and palm wine, while the men danced and drummed, their voices rising into the starry sky. Elders told tales of how the python had protected the village in times of crisis, appearing in moments of danger and guiding the lost back home. The festival was a celebration of gratitude, a time to honor the balance between the people and the spirits. A son returns to the village. Into this world of tradition and reverence came Chibuzo, a man who had spent most of his life far from the sacred lands of Umuahia. Raised in the bustling city, he had learned to value reason over superstition, practicality over tradition. To him, the old ways were nothing more than relics of the past, stories meant to entertain children, not rules that govern life. Chibuzo had returned to Umuahia with his wife, Edeora, and their two young sons, Obina and Chinidu. He had inherited land from his late father, and though he had little attachments to the village, he saw an opportunity to build a new life there. The villagers welcomed him warmly, eager to reconnect with the son of one of their own. But they soon sensed his skepticism, his quiet amusement at their customs. One evening, as the elders gathered around the fire to share stories, they spoke of the sacred Eke Python and its role as the village's protector. Chibuzo chuckled, shaking his head. "It's just a snake," he muttered under his breath. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, Papa Nana, a man with deep lines of wisdom etched into his face, placed a hand on Chibuzo's shoulder. "My son, you do not understand. The Eke is not just an ordinary snake. It carries the spirit of Ola. To harm it is to invite misfortune upon yourself and your family." Chibuzo smiled politely but said nothing. He had no intention of arguing with them, but deep inside, he remained unconvinced. The act that shook the village. Days passed, and Chibuzo settled into his new home. He worked on his farm, cleared the land, and did his best to ignore the whispers of the villagers about the sacred Eke Python. Then, on one fateful afternoon, as he walked along the riverbank, he saw it. The Eke Python lay stretched out in the sun, its long, gleaming body basking in the warmth. Its scales shimmered like burnished bronze, and its gentle movements were almost hypnotic. To Chibuzo, it was nothing more than a large snake. He grabbed a thick branch from the ground and moved closer, his heart pounding. This was his chance to prove to himself, and to the villagers, that their beliefs were nothing but superstition. Without hesitation, he raised the branch and brought it down with force. The python hissed, recoiled, and thrashed for a brief moment before falling still. Chibuzo wiped the sweat from his brow and laughed softly, shaking his head. "And they call this a spirit," he muttered to himself. Then, he left the body by the riverbank and walked away, never once looking back. The village reacts. That evening, the village gathered at the sound of loud cries. A young boy, fetching water from the river, had stumbled upon the lifeless body of the sacred Eke Python. He had run back, breathless, to alert the elders. When the villagers arrived, they stood in horrified silence. Some fell to their knees, whispering prayers to Allah, while others clutched their heads in disbelief. Papa Nana knelt beside the snake, his eyes filled with sorrow. Who has done this? His voice trembled, heavy with grief. No one spoke, but deep down, they all knew. As the crowd gathered outside Chibuzo's home, murmurs of anger and fear rippled through them. When he finally stepped out to face them, he was met with stares of disbelief. You killed the sacred Eke," a woman whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Chibuzo folded his arms, unbothered. "It was just a snake," he said again. A gasp went through the crowd. Even Edeora, his wife, covered her mouth in shock. Papa Nana stepped forward. "Chibuzo, do you not understand what you have done?" he asked, his voice filled with pain. "This is no ordinary creature. You have broken the sacred bond between us and the goddess. There will be consequences." Chibuzo scoffed. "Consequences? Do you hear yourselves? This is exactly why people mock tradition like this. A snake is a snake, old man. If misfortune comes, it will be because of natural reasons, not some curse." But the villagers saw the dark cloud forming above his head, even if he did not. That night, as the village prepared for sleep, the winds changed. The air grew heavy, thick with something unspoken and unseen. The crickets, which normally filled the night with their chorus, fell silent. The river, once clear and shimmering, began to darken. And somewhere in the distance, a single low hiss echoed through the trees. The spirit of the Sacred Eke Python had been awakened. And it was watching the curse unfold. The days that followed the death of the Sacred Eke Python were unlike any the people of Umuahia had ever known. At first, there were small signs. The river, which had always flowed steadily, began to slow. The women fetching water noticed its murkiness, an unsettling cloudiness that had never been there before. By the third day, the river stopped flowing altogether, leaving only cracked earth where water once shimmered under the sun. Then, the crops began to wither. The once green fields of yam, cassava, and maize turned yellow and dry, their leaves curling under the harsh sun. Farmers whispered among themselves, their hands running through the lifeless soil, unable to explain why the land had suddenly betrayed them. A strange heaviness settled over the village. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing down on everyone's shoulders. Laughter disappeared from the streets, and even the village drummers fell silent, their rhythms replaced by uneasy murmurs. But for Chibuzo, none of it mattered. To him, these were coincidences, natural events that had nothing to do with an old legend. Until tragedy struck his own home. A father's denial. It was late in the afternoon when Chibuzo's eldest son, Obina, collapsed in the yard. One moment, he had been running with his younger brother, Chinidu, their laughter ringing through the air. The next, he was on the ground, his body trembling with fever. Edeora rushed to him, her heart pounding as she placed a hand on his forehead. His skin was burning hot, his breath shallow. "Chibuzo! Come quickly," she screamed. Chibuzo, who had been walking on the farm, ran back to the house, his stomach twisting at the sight of his son. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling beside the boy. "I don't know. He was fine just a moment ago," Edeora said, her eyes brimming with tears. They carried Obina inside, laying him on a mat while Edeora prepared a cold cloth to cool his fever. But no matter what they did, the boy grew weaker. His eyes, usually full of life, were now dull and distant. The village elders soon arrived, led by Papa Nana. They entered the house, their expressions grave. "The boy has been touched by the curse," the old man said solemnly. "The Sacred Eke Python does not forgive easily." Chibuzo scowled. "Enough of this nonsense. My son is sick because of the heat, not because of a snake." Papa Nana shook his head. "Chibuzo, open your eyes. The river has dried. The crops have died. Your son has fallen ill. These are not mere coincidences." The other elders nodded in agreement, their faces lined with worry. "You must seek forgiveness," another elder urged. The spirit of the Eke Python is angry. It will not stop until justice is served. But Chibuzo refused to listen. I will not bow to superstition, he spat, his frustration mounting. I will take my son to a real doctor, not rely on foolish old stories. The elders exchanged glances, their eyes filled with sorrow. They had seen this before, pride before ruin. If you will not listen, then we can do nothing more, Papa Nana said. But know this, Allah does not forget. With that, they turned and left, their absence leaving behind a suffocating silence. The second blow. 3 days passed, and Obina's condition worsened. His body became frail, his once strong frame now little more than skin and bones. He barely spoke, his lips cracked from fever, his eyes glazed with suffering. Edeora barely left his side, whispering prayers through tear-streaked cheeks. Please, Chibuzo, she begged. Listen to the elders. Let us ask for forgiveness before it is too late. But Chibuzo only shook his head. I will not be ruled by fear, he muttered. My son will recover. Then, on the 4th day, tragedy struck again. Chinedu, their younger son, collapsed without warning, his small body racked with the same fever. Edeora let out a wail of anguish, her hands clutching her son's limp form. No, 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 she sobbed. Chibuzo froze, his chest tightening with panic. One sick child was explainable. 2. The doubt he had buried so deeply began to surface. The villagers, watching from a distance, murmured amongst themselves. The curse has taken hold. The once proud and defiant Chibuzo now stood in the shadow of something he could not explain. A warning from the spirit world. That night, Chibuzo could not sleep. His sons lay side by side, their weak breathing the only sound in the room. Edeora knelt between them, whispering prayers to any god who would listen. Chibuzo stepped outside, staring up at the black sky. The stars were hidden, swallowed by dark clouds that had not been there moments ago. Then, he heard it. A low, drawn-out hiss. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, wrapping around him like a chilling wind. Chibuzo's heart pounded as he turned toward the forest. His legs felt heavy, his breath shallow. And then, he saw it. A massive python slithered out from the darkness, its scales glowing with an eerie light. Its eyes, large, golden, and piercing, bore into him. Chibuzo stumbled back, his body paralyzed with terror. The python did not attack. It simply watched, unblinking. Its gaze was not filled with anger, but with something worse, judgment. Then, without a sound, it vanished. Chibuzo stood frozen, his body drenched in cold sweat. For the first time in his life, fear gripped his soul. Maybe, just maybe, the elders had been right all along. Whispers of vengeance. By dawn, word of Chibuzo's vision had spread. The villagers whispered in hushed voices, their fears now confirmed, the spirit of the Eke Python had come to pass judgment. Papa Nana and the elders arrived once more, their faces heavy with the weight of knowledge. You have seen it, haven't you? The old man asked, his voice quiet yet firm. Chibuzo did not answer. He could not. Papa Nana sighed. The spirit watches you, Chibuzo. But its patience is not endless. You have one choice, seek forgiveness, or suffer its wrath. Edeora turned to her husband, her eyes red from crying. Please, Chibuzo. If not for yourself, then for our sons. Chibuzo looked at his children, barely breathing on their mats. His hands trembled. For the first time, he did not have an answer. The once unshakable man was now a father standing at the edge of ruin. And somewhere, in the depths of the village, the spirit of the Sacred Eke Python waited. Its vengeance had only begun the search for redemption. The once proud Chibuzo now stood at the edge of despair. His two sons, Obinna and Chinedu, lay weak and feverish, their breathing shallow. Edeora never left their side, her once bright eyes now hollow with grief. It had been 5 days since the sickness began, and despite every effort, medicinal herbs, healers, even sacrifices of goats to the gods, nothing had changed. The crops remained dead. The river was still dry. And the village of Umuahia had grown silent with fear. Chibuzo, once so sure of himself, now felt the weight of his arrogance crushing him. He had called it just a snake. Now, standing in the dark room where his children lay, he whispered, "What have I done?" A desperate plea for help. By morning, Edeora had had enough. She grabbed Chibuzo's arm, her grip strong despite her exhaustion. "If you love your sons, if you love me, you will go to Mama Ozioma today," she demanded. Chibuzo, broken and desperate, could no longer argue. So, for the first time in his life, he set aside his pride and went in search of the village's high priestess. Meeting Mama Ozioma. The hut of Mama Ozioma sat at the edge of the forest, hidden beneath towering silk cotton trees. She was a woman of mystery and wisdom, feared and respected in equal measure. Some said she could see into the spirit world, that she walked between life and death. Chibuzo arrived at her doorstep, his heart pounding. He had once mocked her, dismissed her as an old woman telling tales. Now, she was his last hope. The door swung open before he could knock. Mama Ozioma stood there, her dark eyes unreadable. She wore a flowing robe of deep blue, and her face was painted with white sacred markings. Without a word, she turned and walked inside. Chibuzo followed nervously, his hands clenched into fists. Inside, the air smelled of burning herbs and ancient incense. Skulls of small animals lined the walls, and a large bowl of black water sat in the center of the room. Mama Ozioma motioned for him to sit. He did so, his throat tight with fear. She studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke. "The spirits have been waiting for you, Chibuzo." Chibuzo shuddered. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My sons, they are dying." Mama Ozioma nodded. "And you know why?" He lowered his head. "Yes." A long silence stretched between them before the priestess spoke again. "You have disrespected Allah and broken the sacred bond." Her voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of an ancient truth. The Eke Python is not an ordinary creature. It is the guardian of Umuahia, the spirit of the land. You struck it down without thought, and now the land has turned against you. The river has dried, the crops have withered, and your own blood suffers. Chibuzo closed his eyes. "What must I do?" Mama Ozioma leaned forward. "You must give the Eke Python a proper burial," she said. "Treat it as you would a family member. Mourn it. Honor it. Only then may the spirit consider your plea." The ritual of atonement. The priestess explained the ritual in detail. Chibuzo must find the remains of the python he had killed and place it in a white-cloth casket. He would then organize a full burial ceremony, just as one would for a deceased elder. The ritual required a small wooden casket, covered in white cloth. Offerings of kola nuts, palm oil, yams, and palm wine. A funeral procession through the village, where the people would mourn the python. A public apology and prayers to Allah. It would be a humiliating act for Chibuzo, but the spirits demanded it. A man's struggle with pride. Chibuzo felt his stomach twist. Bury a snake like a human being. He wanted to argue, to resist, but deep down, he knew there was no other choice. His sons were dying. His village was suffering. He would do whatever it took. Even if it meant swallowing his pride. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I will do it." Mama Ozioma watched him carefully. "Good," she said. "But know this, even if you do this, forgiveness is not guaranteed. The spirit must decide. Chibuzo shivered at her words. The weight of his mistake had never felt heavier. Gathering the remains. With the help of a few reluctant villagers, Chibuzo returned to the riverbank where he had killed the sacred Eke. What they found sent chills down his spine. The python's remains had not decayed. Despite the passing days, its body was untouched, as if it had only died moments ago. The villagers whispered among themselves. "The spirit still lingers," one of them said. Chibuzo, swallowing the lump in his throat, carefully lifted the python's body and placed it in the prepared white-cloth casket. His hands trembled as he did so. The python, even in death, felt like it was watching him. The procession of shame. The next day, the entire village gathered for the funeral. It was an unheard-of event, a man burying a python as one would bury an elder. Chibuzo led the somber procession, carrying the small casket in his arms. Edeora walked beside him, tears streaming down her face, her prayers silent but urgent. The villagers wailed and sang songs of mourning, their voices echoing through the hills. At the burial site, Papa Nana stood waiting, his old eyes filled with sorrow. Chibuzo knelt before the grave, his hands trembling as he placed the casket into the earth. He poured palm wine onto the soil, sprinkled kola nuts, and bowed his head. Then, in front of the entire village, he did something he never thought he would do. He wept. "I have wronged the spirit of the land," he said, his voice breaking. "I have let my arrogance blind me. Forgive me, O sacred Eke. Forgive my foolishness." The villagers watched, their hearts heavy with the weight of the moment. The burial was completed. The prayers were said. But the spirit of the Eke Python remained silent. Had the sacrifice been enough? The spirit's judgment awaits. As the villagers returned home, Chibuzo felt a strange stillness in the air. The earth seemed to hold its breath. That night, he did not sleep. He knew the truth. The ritual had been performed. But the spirit had yet to pass judgment. Would it be forgiveness? Or would vengeance still come? In the distance, a low hiss echoed through the wind. The sacred Eke Python was watching. And soon, it would decide his fate. The ritual of atonement. The village of Umuahia had never witnessed a funeral like this before. From the elders to the youngest children, every soul gathered under the heavy grey sky. A strange hush blanketed the land, as if the very earth itself was waiting for what was to come. In the center of the gathering, Chibuzo stood, the once proud skeptic now a man humbled by fate. In his hands, he carried the small white-cloth casket that held the remains of the sacred Eke Python. His eyes brimmed with tears, his hands trembled under the weight, not of the casket, but of the shame and regret that pressed upon his spirit. Edeora walked beside him, silent in her grief, her eyes swollen from days of crying. Behind them, their two sons, Obina and Chinidu, too weak to stand, were carried on mats by the village women. The fever still clung to their fragile bodies. Would this ritual be enough to save them? Would the spirit of the sacred Eke listen? Would Ola, the earth goddess, forgive? A procession of sorrow. The funeral procession moved slowly through the village, past huts and farmland that once flourished but now stood lifeless. Women wailed in mourning, their voices raw with emotion. Men beat drums of sorrow, their rhythms heavy and slow. Some villagers still watched warily from the sidelines, unsure if this atonement would be enough to undo the curse that hung over Umuahia. Near the front, Papa Nana walked solemnly, his aged face carved with both wisdom and sorrow. He whispered to Chibuzo, "Hold your heart open, my son. If your regret is not true, the spirits will know." Chibuzo swallowed hard. He had never believed before. But now, standing at the edge of the unknown, he realized how much he needed mercy. He had been a fool. The burial of the sacred guardian. At the sacred burial site, a pit had been dug deep into the red earth. Before it, an altar had been set, laden with the offerings demanded by the gods. Kola nuts, their brown shells split open as a sign of sincerity. Yams, the sacred root of the Igbo people, symbolizing life and sustenance. Palm oil, poured gently upon the ground, a plea for balance to be restored. Palm wine, in a carved wooden cup, to be shared between the living and the spirits. Chibuzo placed the casket on the altar, his breath shallow. Mama Ozioma stepped forward, her white robes billowing in the wind. Her face was painted in the sacred symbols of the spirit world, her voice low and deep as she began to chant the ancient prayers. She raised her arms to the sky, calling upon Ola, the earth goddess. Great Ola, mother of the land, keeper of balance, hear us. Your servant was struck down in ignorance. The bond was broken. We come now with humble hearts, seeking your mercy. Restore your favor upon this land. Restore life to those who suffer. Let the river flow once more. Let the land breathe again. The villagers echoed her words, their voices rising into the heavens. Chibuzo fell to his knees, pressing his forehead to the ground. Forgive me, he whispered. Forgive my blindness. I have seen the truth. I was wrong. Edeora knelt beside him, her hands clutching his. Forgive us, she pleaded. The village elders raised their staffs, marking the final moment of prayer. Then, as Mama Ozioma spoke the last sacred words, the earth shuddered beneath them. The spirit listens. A strong wind roared through the village, howling like a voice from the beyond. Dust swirled through the air, trees bent under the force, and the villagers gasped in awe. Then, from the burial site, a soft glow emerged, pulsating gently like a heartbeat. The wind stilled, and for a moment, everything was silent. Not a breath of air moved. Not a single leaf rustled. The Sacred Eke Python had heard them. It was listening. Mourning and healing. The villagers wept openly, their bodies trembling with relief and uncertainty. Some clapped their hands in prayer, others whispered, "The spirit has answered." Chibuzo remained on his knees, his shoulders shaking. He had entered this ritual a broken man, unsure of what he believed. But now, in this moment, he knew. The Sacred Eke Python had never been just a snake. It was a guardian, a bridge between the living and the divine. As the burial was completed, the villagers sang songs of healing, their voices rising into the cleansed air. The ceremony had ended. But the question remained. Had the spirit forgiven him? Would the land recover? Would his sons wake up? Or had the Sacred Eke Python already passed its final judgment? As the sun set behind the hills, Chibuzo turned to Mama Ozioma, his voice raw. Is it over? She studied him for a long time before answering. The spirit has heard you, she said. But whether it chooses mercy or vengeance, that is not for us to decide. The fate of Umuahia still hung in the balance. And in the distance, beyond the hills, the whisper of a low, deep hiss called through the night, the judgment of the spirit. That night, Umuahia lay in absolute silence. Not even the cricket sang, nor did the wind stir the trees. It was as if the entire world held its breath, waiting. Inside his heart, Chibuzo sat awake, his heart heavy. The funeral was over, the prayers had been spoken, the Sacred Eke Python had been laid to rest. But still, his sons lay motionless on their mats, their breaths shallow, their bodies weak. Had the spirit accepted his plea for forgiveness? Had he done enough? His wife, Edeora, sat beside their children, her lips moving in silent prayer. Chibuzo placed a trembling hand on his eldest son's forehead. It was still warm with fever. He closed his eyes. Then, sleep overtook him. A dream from the beyond. Chibuzo found himself standing in the middle of an endless field. The sky above was dark, swirling with heavy clouds, yet a golden glow surrounded him, illuminating the tall grass at his feet. And then, he saw it. The Eke Python. It was larger than before, its body stretching far beyond the horizon, its scales gleaming like polished gold. But it did not hiss. It did not strike. It simply watched him. Its golden eyes, once filled with vengeance, were now filled with something unexpected. Sorrow. Chibuzo's chest tightened. Why did it look at him like that? He fell to his knees. I was blind, he whispered. I did not understand. I thought I was stronger than the spirits. I was wrong. The python blinked slowly, its head lowering until it was level with him. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself, it spoke. You severed the bond, but you have tried to mend it. The land remembers. The spirits remember. You have been given a second chance. Chibuzo's breath caught in his throat. A second chance. The python did not answer. Instead, it began to fade, its golden form dissolving into the wind. As it vanished, a voice echoed through the sky. Honor the bond, and the land will honor you. Then, Chibuzo woke up. A miracle had done. The moment Chibuzo's eyes opened, he knew something had changed. The air in the hut was cooler, lighter, no longer thick with the weight of sorrow. Then, a soft voice spoke beside him. Papa. Chibuzo turned sharply, his heart hammering in his chest. His son Chinedu was awake. For the first time in weeks, his small body was free of fever. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, shone with light. Chinedu. Edeora gasped, rushing to him. She gathered him in her arms, sobbing with relief. Then, from the other side of the mat, a second voice spoke. Mama. Chibuzo whirled around. His eldest son, Obina, had opened his eyes. Tears streamed down Adaora's face as she covered her mouth in shock. Their sons were healed. The spirit had shown mercy. The land breathed again. As the sun rose, the village awoke to a second miracle. The river, which had been nothing more than a cracked bed of dust, was flowing once more. The water, once murky and lifeless, now glistened under the morning light, pure and fresh. The villagers rushed to the riverbank, whispering in awe. The crops, which had stood dry and withered for weeks, began to turn green again, as if life had been breathed back into the soil. Women wept with joy. Men fell to their knees in gratitude. And in the distance, near the burial site of the Sacred Eke Python, a single, small python slithered through the grass, its golden eyes reflecting the sunlight. The spirit had returned. Balance had been restored. The guardian of the Sacred Eke. The village elders gathered later that day, standing before Chibuzo and his family. Papa Nana placed a hand on Chibuzo's shoulder, his face filled with wisdom. Allah has shown mercy. The Sacred Eke has given you a second chance. But with mercy comes duty. Chibuzo nodded, already knowing what the elder would say. From this day forward, you will be the guardian of the Sacred Eke. You will teach the next generation. You will ensure that no one forgets the bond between the people and the spirit of the land. Chibuzo fell to his knees in acceptance. The man who had once mocked tradition, who had once called the python nothing more than a snake, now understood its true place in the world. And he would spend the rest of his life protecting the sacred bond he had once broken. A story for the ages. As the years passed, the story of Chibuzo's folly and redemption became a legend in Umuahia. Elders told the tale on moonlit nights, warning children never to disrespect the spirit of the land. The Sacred Eke Python was never harmed again. And each year, during the festival of the Sacred Eke, Chibuzo stood at the forefront, leading the village in prayer, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. The balance had been restored. The land had forgiven. But the spirit was always watching. and it would never forget the legacy of the Sacred Eke Python, the guardian of the Sacred Eke. Years passed, and the village of Umuahia flourished once more. The river ran full and clear, the fields were lush with crops, and the people lived in harmony with the land. At the heart of it all was Chibuzo, no longer the arrogant young man who had mocked the traditions of his ancestors. Now, he was a respected elder, known by all as the guardian of the Sacred Eke. His hair, once thick and dark, had turned to streaks of silver. His face bore the lines of wisdom earned through years of reflection and service. And though time had changed him, one thing remained constant, the sacred duty he had accepted. Every night, beneath the glow of the full moon, the children of Umuahia gathered around him, eager for a story. He sat by the great iroko tree at the center of the village, the firelight casting shadows across his face. His voice, deep and steady, carried through the air as he told them the tale of the Sacred Eke Python. Of the man who had doubted. Of the curse that had fallen. Of the mercy that had been given. The children listened wide-eyed, clutching their knees, their faces filled with wonder. And when he finished, he always spoke the same words. The spirit of the Sacred Eke watches over us all. Honor the land, and the land will honor you. Disrespect the bond, and the balance will break again. The children nodded solemnly, the lesson etched into their hearts. They would never forget. The return of the Sacred Eke. As the seasons passed, the Sacred Eke Python slowly returned to the village. At first, it was a whisper in the wind, a rustling in the bushes, a shadow slipping through the trees. Then, one evening during the festival of the Sacred Eke, the people saw it for the first time in years. A single, golden-eyed python slithered through the festival grounds. It was not afraid. It moved gracefully among the villagers, weaving between their feet, watching as they sang, danced, and honored the spirits. No one screamed. No one ran. Instead, they bowed their heads in respect, stepping aside to let it pass. The balance had been restored. And the guardian spirit had returned. From that day forward, the Sacred Eke Python appeared at all important events, weddings, funerals, harvest celebrations, and births. It was a sign of blessings, of protection, of harmony. No one in Umuahia doubted its presence anymore. Not even Chibuzo. The sons who were given a second chance. Chibuzo's sons, Obina and Chinedu, grew into strong men, forever grateful for the second chance they had been given. They, too, became guardians of the tradition, ensuring that the lessons of the past would never be forgotten. Obina became a healer, studying the sacred plants and remedies of their ancestors. He believed that life, like nature, had to be protected and nurtured. Chinedu, once frail with sickness, became a great storyteller, traveling to neighboring villages to share the tale of the Sacred Eke Python. The brothers knew that without the spirit's mercy, they would not be alive. And so, every year, during the festival of the Sacred Eke, they knelt beside their father and whispered their prayers of gratitude. They would never forget how close they had come to losing everything. A village that thrives. The village of Umuahia had changed, but its heart remained the same. People no longer feared the Sacred Eke Python. They respected it. The river never ran dry again. The crops never withered before their time. The land and its people flourished together, each honoring the other. The story of Chibuzo's mistake and redemption became a part of the village's folklore, passed down from generation to generation. Every child in Umuahia knew the tale. And none would ever dare to harm the Sacred Eke again. A question for the future. One evening, as the sky burned with the colors of the setting sun, an old man sat beneath the iroko tree, surrounded by children. It was Papa Chibuzo, his voice still strong despite his years. He had just finished telling the story of the Sacred Eke Python when a young boy, no older than 7, raised his hand. "Grandfather," he asked, his voice small but curious, "is the Eke Python still watching over us?" Chibuzo smiled. He looked up at the sky, at the stars beginning to twinkle in the deepening blue, at the wind that whispered through the trees, at the village that stood strong and prosperous. Then, he turned back to the boy, his eyes warm with certainty. Always, he said. And somewhere, in the distance, a soft hiss drifted through the night. The spirit of the Sacred Eke was still there. Watching. Protecting. Forever. The end.